There are moments in history when leadership stops being only about laws, elections, or power. It becomes something else, something quieter, deeper, and more difficult to measure. In recent years, the name Ibrahim Traoré has come to represent such a moment for many people in Burkina Faso, and increasingly for observers beyond its borders. To some, he is a young military officer who rose quickly in a time of crisis. To others, he is a symbol of resistance against dependency and stagnation. And to a growing number of ordinary citizens, he represents something more abstract: a sense of moral direction, a return to dignity, a feeling that leadership can once again carry meaning. This perception does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges from years of insecurity, economic pressure, and disappointment with political systems that promised progress but delivered uncertainty. In such conditions, people do not only search for better policies, they search for purpose. This is where Traoré's vision becomes interesting, not as a matter of ideology, but as a narrative that blends politics with values often associated with the spiritual world: self-reliance, integrity, sacrifice, and collective destiny. This discussion is not about declaring him a hero or a villain. It is about understanding why, in a fragile historical moment, leadership begins to be described not only in strategic terms, but in moral ones, and why some people quietly ask whether his role is political or something closer to a calling. One reason Traoré's leadership attracts such attention is not only what he does, but how he explains why he does it. In his speeches, certain ideas return again and again, not as technical policies, but as moral principles. The first is self-reliance. He speaks of a nation that must learn to stand on its own feet, not as an act of pride, but as an act of responsibility. The message is simple and powerful. Dignity cannot be outsourced. A country that depends entirely on others for its security, its food, or its direction slowly forgets how to trust itself. In this sense, self-reliance becomes more than an economic strategy. It becomes a form of discipline, a way of teaching society that freedom is not given, but practiced. The second principle is integrity. Traoré often describes leadership as service rather than privilege. He presents authority not as a reward, but as a burden that must be carried carefully. This language stands in contrast to a long-standing image of politics as a competition for status and comfort. Whether one agrees with him or not, the symbolism is clear. A leader should be measured not by what he gains, but by what he refuses to take. The third principle is Pan-African solidarity. In his vision, Burkina Faso is not an isolated story. It is part of a larger African narrative, one shaped by shared history, shared wounds, and shared possibilities. Cooperation among African nations is framed not only as practical, but as ethical. A duty to one another in a world that often treats the continent as fragmented and replaceable. Taken together, these ideas form a language that sounds less like ordinary politics and more like a moral framework. Not promises of quick success, but appeals to character. Not only plans, but convictions. This is why many listeners do not hear his words as campaign rhetoric. They hear them as statements of belief. In times of stability, citizens usually judge leaders by numbers: growth, inflation, employment, security. In times of uncertainty, the measure quietly changes. People begin to ask different questions. Who speaks with conviction? Who seems difficult to intimidate? Who appears willing to carry the weight of unpopular decisions? And slowly, often without realizing it, society starts to describe leadership in symbolic terms. This is how the idea of a chosen leader is born. Not necessarily chosen by heaven in a literal sense, but chosen by circumstance, by history, by the emotional needs of a population living under pressure. In Burkina Faso, Several factors contribute to this perception. Traore is young, which contrasts sharply with older political traditions. He speaks in a language of duty rather than entitlement. He presents himself as someone shaped by hardship, not comfort. And he leads during a period when fear and uncertainty are part of everyday life. For many citizens, this combination creates a powerful psychological image. A leader who did not seek greatness, but was pushed toward it. Social scientists call this phenomenon the moral elevation of authority. It occurs when political leadership begins to overlap with the human desire for meaning. The leader becomes more than a decision-maker. He becomes a symbol through which people interpret their own suffering and hopes. This does not mean the perception is objectively true or false. It means it is understandable. When institutions feel fragile, people attach themselves to stories. When the future is unclear, they look for figures who seem steady. When pain lasts too long, they search for meaning within it. In this way, the language of destiny enters politics quietly, without being officially declared. Not as propaganda, not as doctrine, but as a collective interpretation. A way of saying, perhaps this moment and this person are not random. The idea that a leader may carry more than political responsibility is not new. Across cultures and centuries, societies have often described certain figures as having a mission rather than merely a position. Not because they were perfect, but because their role seemed to rise from crisis, and their authority appeared rooted in meaning rather than procedure. In religious traditions, this language is familiar. In the Hebrew Bible, Moses does not seek power. He resists it, doubts himself, and accepts leadership only after repeated hesitation. His authority comes not from ambition, but from a sense of obligation. David, a shepherd, becomes king not through status, but through circumstance. Jeremiah describes himself as too young, too unprepared, yet compelled by a voice he cannot ignore. In these stories, leadership is not presented as reward. It is presented as burden. History outside religion offers similar patterns. Joan of Arc spoke of duty rather than strategy. Abraham Lincoln described the Civil War as a moral trial more than a political contest. Thomas Sankara framed governance as service to future generations, not ownership of the present. In each case, followers did something remarkable. They interpreted leadership as destiny, not necessarily divine in a theological sense, but moral in a collective one. The leader became a vessel for shared hopes, fears, and unresolved questions. This is what people mean when they speak of a sacred mission. It does not require miracles. It does not demand perfection. It simply reflects a belief that some moments in history are too heavy to be carried by ordinary ambition alone. When applied to modern leadership, this concept does not claim supernatural truth. It describes a relationship between a society in pain and a figure onto whom that society projects purpose. Whether this belief endures or fades depends not on language, but on time, outcomes, and accountability. But its emergence tells us something important. When politics loses credibility, people search for meaning. When systems feel empty, they fill them with story. And sometimes, leadership becomes the place where those stories gather. Seen from this perspective, Ibrahim Traoré exists in two parallel forms. One is concrete and measurable. A head of state facing security threats, economic limits, social expectations, and the unavoidable complexity of governing a fragile country. The other is symbolic. A figure onto whom many project their desire for renewal, dignity, and direction. Neither version cancels the other. They coexist. This is the quiet tension at the heart of leadership shaped by moral expectation. Symbols inspire, but reality tests. A narrative of purpose can unite people, but it can also place an enormous weight on a single individual. No leader, regardless of conviction, can replace institutions. No sense of destiny can substitute for transparent systems, long-term planning, and shared responsibility. History shows this clearly. Some leaders who were once seen as chosen strengthened their nations by turning hope into durable structures. Others were overwhelmed by the role society created for them. The difference was never in the language they used. It was in what followed. For Traore, the question is therefore not whether he carries a mission, sacred or symbolic. The deeper question is this: can moral authority become institutional trust? Can personal discipline become collective stability? Can a story of dignity become a system that protects dignity for everyone? These answers cannot be written in speeches. They will emerge slowly, through outcomes that affect ordinary lives: safety, work, education, and the quiet return of predictability. For now, his leadership occupies a rare space, between politics and meaning, between strategy and belief. To some, this is dangerous. To others, necessary. To most, simply human. Because when societies endure long uncertainty, they do not only elect leaders, they search for orientation. And sometimes, they find it not in policies alone, but in the idea that history itself has paused, pointed to a moment, and whispered, "Pay attention." Not because the leader is flawless, but because the time demands more than routine. And because, in fragile seasons, even politics begins to speak the language of the soul.